you so much again for being here. And now I would like to introduce Diana Dabek. She's a PhD candidate in the Department of English at the University of Miami. She's also an adjunct professor at Florida International University, where she regularly teaches courses in English, literature, and composition. As a college instructor, Diana strives to design and teach courses that spark student interest in learning, literacy, and inquiry. For the last 4 years, her efforts have been focused on finding new and innovative ways to engage the latest generations of college students, the iGen. What motivates this new generation of students? What are their learning styles and preferences? And more importantly, what are their expectations and assumptions about what a college education should entail? These questions and many more like them fuel and inform Diana's student-centered approach to teaching. Please join me in welcoming her today to our talk.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm here to talk to you about the ways in which a new generation of college students is really shaping the ways in which we are learning, and also the ways in which faculty are teaching here, not just at Florida International University, but really nationwide. So before we get to the topic of discussion, which is the iGen, I think it's important for us to backtrack just a little bit and to understand what came before iGen, right? So, excuse me. So in that case, it would be the Millennials, right? So I think it's going to be useful for us to take just a couple of minutes to kind of dig a little bit deeper, find out what the Millennials were like. How many of you are Millennials or know if you are a Millennial? We'll see if that's true in a second, because that term actually fluctuates quite often and the years change. So for some reason, researchers can't agree on what a Millennial should look like, and we keep on getting slumped into one category or the next, right? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that and whether or not you're actually a Millennial and how that affects the ways in which you've been learning throughout your college career. So I want to start a little bit by talking about my own teaching trajectory and to tell you a little bit about how my own teaching experiences have really shaped the ways in which I perceive teaching, and also how I've noticed really some significant generational changes specifically in the writing classroom. So I teach here at FIU, ENC 1101, ENC 1102. I teach Lit 1000, so that would be Intro to Literature, and I also teach Approaches to Literature, ENG 2012. So those two are the gateway courses to an English degree, and then the first two are first-year writing courses here at FIU, which are mandatory for most college students unless you test out of it or unless you have another exemption for the course. So that's been the extent of my experience with college students, and I've been teaching here at FIU since 2010. So as soon as I finished my master's, I started teaching courses here, and this is what a conventional class looked like in 2010. This clearly is not me. However, I think it's an accurate representation of what a college classroom looked like almost 10 years ago, right? So what you notice here is that you have the instructor who is just kind of jotting down main points from his lesson on what is actually a chalkboard, which has become really antiquated in our classes. We hardly see these anymore across FIU or just generally across most colleges or universities in the States. So he's jotting down notes, and then the students are listening intently. You don't see any phones out, right? You don't see any laptops out. That's because it's 2010, and those technologies were not as readily or widely available as they are today, right? So in 10 years, or not even in 9 years, quite a bit has changed in terms of how we're experiencing the college classroom, both from the experience of the instructor, but also from the experience of the students who are receiving information in a very different way, right? They're sitting, they're listening to a lecture, they're taking notes with their pen and paper, and it's definitely a different feel for the students, right? And same thing for the instructor. The instructor is just kind of disseminating knowledge, having maybe a conversation with the students, more lecture-based situation that we have here back in 2010, right? So that was 10 years ago, and the major student population back then were called Millennials. So Millennials have a wide array of nicknames that they go by. Some of them are called Next Gen, the Me Gen, because they tend to be perceived as being very egocentric, right? Or the Gen Y. So that means that if you were born anywhere from 1981 to 1996, you are technically a millennial. So now let's try that again. Who's a millennial? Okay, so we still have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so quite a few of you. Good. So I too am a millennial. And there have been certain events that have shaped the ways in which we are kind of understanding ourselves and how we make meaning of our generation, right? So we have shared experiences as millennials who have been born within this time period and who have grown up and come of age with certain events that have really marked our understanding of our identity, right? So, of course, we as millennials have a very vivid memory of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, right? Some of us were in high school, maybe some of you were a little bit younger, some of you might have been a little bit older, right? But nonetheless, you should vividly remember that specific event if you are born anywhere from 1981 to 1996. And of course, other really important events that shaped our understanding of self and identity, and just of what our generation looks like is the Iraq War, which lasted for so many years, right? So that has also been always kind of on the back burner for us. It's also been something that has been in conversation and dialogue, and it's really immersed and become part of our culture. And of course, we also have financial burdens, economic downfalls, like the housing market crash of 2008, which also has impacted the ways in which we feel about buying a house, right? Getting a 30-year mortgage. Why are we putting off having a family, right? So these are all questions that are posed to millennials, and they're questions that we have, I think, pretty valid answers for, right? Because our experiences have shaped the ways in which we feel about A, financial security, B, national security, right? So it's important to take these into account when we're thinking about our experiences here in the college classroom and how that also impacts how we learn, right? The other major change for millennials is technology, right? So millennials were coming of age during the internet explosion, which happened from 1994 to 1996. So if you are a millennial, your experience with AOL, Instant Messenger, Napster, right, all of these kind of very dated technologies is very different from that of today's 21 to 20-year-old incoming freshman college student, right? They don't have experience with these outdated modes of technology, right? And also, we're kind of looking at cell phones differently, right? So we were coming of age at a point where we did have flip phones, right? Yeah, right. We liked our Razor, right? And the little song it would sing to us. Yeah, it was fun. And we didn't feel the need to have it constantly attached to the hip, right? Like it wasn't an appendage. So we were okay with having our phone in our back pocket or in our purse and using it just for talking because there was no FaceTime, right? We couldn't text. So again, our understanding of how technology works and the applications for it really different from other generations, right? We have very different experiences that shape our beliefs, our values, and our attitudes towards our own generation. And of course, like with any generation, there are myths about what we're like, right? So, these are stereotypes that have been strengthened by media, by movies, by TV, by the news, by reports that constantly come out. But for instance, here I have a photo from the movie Mallrats. Is anyone familiar with that title, Mallrats from 1995? No. Okay, so I'm definitely dating myself here. So these movies like Mallrats, Slacker, which was released in 91 and 95 respectively, really shaped the culture of millennials, right? Millennials were kind of like these grungy kids that just hung out at the mall all day and didn't respect authority and didn't really want to get a job and didn't really want to move out of their parents' house either, which is always kind of a weird thing to have. So because of this, we have now inherited the idea that millennials are lazy, right? And other myths about millennials are that millennials are impossible to please, right? So we always hear, oh, millennials are just so difficult, millennials are always complaining, millennials are so picky, right? So the idea that we seem to be virtually impossible to please, right? Yet we know that all, if not most of these stereotypes are untrue, right? So millennials are lazy. That's false, right? I see millennials here. and you guys raised your hands, you're here, you're in college, right? You're pursuing a degree. I'm sure you work as well, right? You have other responsibilities. So clearly, the fact that we are labeled as lazy is inaccurate, right? And in fact, an article in the Journal of Business and Psychology reports that when compared to the Boomer and Gen Xers, millennials reported higher levels of overall job satisfaction. Right, so it's not like we're not content with what we're doing or we're not wanting to be in the workforce. It's just, again, a perception that we've somehow created for ourselves, right? Again, the idea that millennials are just impossible to please, that's wrong again, right? And then again, looking at this from a different perspective, an article that was recently published in The Economist found that millennials are not all that different from previous generations, right? And it says, quote, they just want to be giving interesting work to do and to be rewarded for it, right? So that's not any different from the previous generations that came before us. We want to do something that's meaningful, and we want to be rewarded for it, right? So again, another stereotype that we managed to dispel here. And then finally, another idea that it kind of gets tossed around in pop culture is a reference that millennials never want to grow up, right? So millennials have been criticized for delaying adulthood, right? Kind of like failure to launch, not wanting to leave home, being very comfortable with mom and dad, right? Yet, although all of that kind of chatter about the fact that millennials don't want to grow up, there is a lot of findings that support the contrary, right? So a recent study that was done by the Pew Research Center found that only 36% of millennials live with their parents. And that, in fact, that percentage is also made up from those that live abroad or are boarding for college, because technically you're still under your parents' household, right? So again, the numbers here are not very clear, but it's definitely not a striking figure like 50%, 75%. 36% of millennials live at home with their parents. And that is not vastly different from the previous generation at all, right? So what is the truth about millennials then? What are we like, and what do we want to be known for, right? So millennials are, again, a tricky category to kind of pinpoint because it's not really clear what specific year or age or date of birth we're supposed to fall under. As a result, we get kind of pinpointed between 2 or 3 different generations very often. And I think as of recently, there's been a great push specifically by just academic research and also popular literature. Like here I have an example of Time magazine, which in May 2013, this was their cover. And they really wanted to relate to their readers that millennials are not what they appear to be, right? So the cover of their magazine reads, millennials are lazy, entitled narcissists who live with their parents. Why they'll save us all, right? So then the article goes on to continue to debunk some of the previous myths that we talked about, right? And to really show that millennials are actually very invested in education, right? The reason why some millennials are delaying leaving the household is because they're interested in pursuing a degree, right? And we're trying to do it maybe without inquiring further student debt. So that's one reason. They have become accustomed to a strong support system because, again, we grew up or came of age right after the financial crisis in 2008. As a result, it's been a lot more difficult for us to be able to get a house loan at the age of 21, right? Or to get a car loan, or to manage that with very high interest rates on student loans. So it's important for us to really kind of put things into perspective, I think, and to really consider the context of our generation, right? Again, our generation is actually quite confident. So maybe that's why the kind of attribution to us being entitled or narcissist. But in fact, it's kind of more of a can-do attitude, right? It's the fact that we feel like we are capable, that we have been taught well, educated well, and that we can actually offer something to our society and to the world at large, right? And again, the other truth about millennials, which is really important, is that although we are not technically considered iGen, because we do differ, and we'll look at that in a second as to how, we are still very much well-versed in existing and emerging technologies, right? So we're all able to text, we're all able to email, we all most likely know how to use social media. all of us are probably very capable of just kind of the day in and day out of just mundane technologies, right? So that, again, makes us desirable for the workforce, and it also shows that we are able to evolve, right? So as technology is evolving and a new generation is coming to light and coming to age, we are still able to maintain ourselves as kind of efficient members of the workforce, right? Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about the truth of millennials. So this is now what we're moving on to, right? So the fact is that we are now kind of leaving millennials behind, right? So we are now moving on to a different type of student population. So, this year, the oldest millennials are turning 38. So that means that they're well into their adulthood. They're out of the college classroom. For the most part, they've graduated from college. They've entered the workforce. They formed families, bought homes, right? So again, they've moved out of this space that we have here, right? And now this space is being populated by a very different generation of students, right? And you can just see that, I'm assuming, just by looking at this picture, right? So what are some of the key differences that you know between the first photo that we looked at from a classroom setting in 2010 and this one that depicts the class from today? What are some of the differences that you know? More students in the class? Okay. Anything else that you kind of notice? Technology. Right. Yes, technology, right? So we have laptops that are open, right? We have a couple of students that are using pen and paper. What about the instructor? How is he using the classroom differently? And I see a hand going up back there. Right, so it's multimodalities, right? So he's not only writing notes on the blackboard, and notice that even the blackboard has advanced to the fact that you can pull the top down and vice versa, so you can have extensive notes, but he's also using the projector, right? So he has his laptop, he's projecting some important notes that he wants students to have, while also using the blackboard, right? So again, the instructor is even functioning very differently here in this particular space, right? So again, these students that you see right here are a new generation of students. They have different expectations of what a college education should look like, and they want different things out of their college education, right? So they differ quite significantly from millennials, right? So they want to use their laptops in class, right? They expect multimodality, and that term basically refers to just different modes, right? So whether that be written, visual, audio, text, different modes of learning, right? So they might want to see a video, and then they might want to do a discussion post on Blackboard, followed by maybe a brief mini lecture on the topic at hand. So again, just wanting that multimodality is really important, right? And they expect that to be part of their coursework. Also, beyond the walls of the classroom, the ways in which instructors and students are communicating and interacting has also changed, right? So back in 2010, when I first started teaching here at FIU, I would give my email to my students on the course syllabus, which I would print out a hard copy, and I would give it to them on the first day of class, and I would say, these are my office hours. If you need to come see me, please email me in advance, or if it doesn't work for you, we can set up a different appointment, right? Now, that doesn't quite work that well, right? I've had students ask me, well, can't we just Skype for our office hours? And I say, well, that's actually a pretty good point. Why can't we Skype, right? So technology and the new generation of college students is kind of pressing instructors to really go outside of their comfort zones to find a place where we're both kind of having an effective and symbiotic relationship, right? So as an instructor, I'm not opposed to having office hours on Skype, right? I think that's a fabulous idea. However, the point that I'm trying to make here is that it would not have occurred to me as a millennial, right? I needed someone from a newer generation to bring this to light for me because I'm not thinking the way that they're thinking, right? So I want to talk a little bit more about how this new generation of students is changing the ways in which we're teaching our college courses, right? So I'm still teaching the same courses. And in fact, some of the content is relatively the same for at least the first year writing courses. Yet, the way in which I'm delivering the course is very different, right? And that's because I need to appeal to a new audience of students who have different needs and different expectations of me as a college instructor. So I want to kind of take a minute talking a little bit more about the iGen, which is the new generation, and kind of thinking a little bit more about who they are, right? So the iGen looks something like this, right? So if you just kind of step outside the walls of this room and you just go out into GC or anywhere else in the university, you will likely see students doing this, right? So in essence, we can assume that this group of students know each other. They might be classmates, they might be friends. However, the way in which they're interacting, for me as a millennial, does not indicate anything to me, right? I just see a lot of people ignoring each other on their phone, right? However, for them, this is completely acceptable. This is the social norm, right? It's okay for you to be texting, posting, liking, checking your IG feed, for you to be on your tablet, maybe submitting a paper while you're just hanging out with your friends, right? I've seen groups of students who are, I can suspect, iGen students, not say a word to each other in like 30 minutes. So that's quite impressive, I have to say. So the mode of kind of interacting has also changed, right? So the way in which students are now thinking of being social and interacting looks very different from what I was accustomed as a millennial student and then as a millennial instructor, right? So again, there has to be a readjustment that has to happen, right? Because time doesn't move backwards, it moves forward, right? So we as instructors have to figure out how we can reconsider our teaching styles and our delivery methods to better fit the needs of these new students. So let's talk a little bit more about the iGen. So who is the iGen? So they've got a couple of nicknames. And just the most important thing to remember is that they were born into a world of internet, social media, and mobile media, right? So if you are part of the iGen, that means that you were born anywhere between 1995 and 2012, right? So that means that currently you're anywhere from the age of 7 to 24, right? And the things that you're accustomed to and the ways in which you interact with people and with technology and how you learn and even how you just consume information is vastly different from the ways in which the previous generation did it, right? So again, just looking back as how we did for the millennials, there are certain events that have really shaped the ways in which the iGen kind of reflects on their values as a generation, right? So they were already born into an economic recession, right? So there was never a time when the housing market was great. It's always been abysmal, right? So that's something to consider, right? So they are kind of cautious about economic growth. They're very cautious about investing. They're very cautious about putting their money in the bank. They have a very different kind of sense of security when it comes to finances because of the time in which they were born, right? And then coming of age. They were, of course, coming of age at a time when there were many international conflicts. They have only known 2 U.S. presidents. That's it. As far as they're concerned, there's no one who comes before these last 2, right? And they have grown up with really, I think what the best way to describe it is a big burden, right? They've grown up consistently hearing about global warming, regardless of what side of the discussion you're on, right? It's just a fact, right? For a student who isn't part of the iGen to think there's a crisis of some sort, whether I'm for this camp or the other, it doesn't matter. It's an ongoing conversation that I'm aware of, right? And other pressing environmental issues, right? Like oil spills, right? Rising sea levels, crazy weather. So these are all concerns that are very much at the forefront for these groups of students. And the most, of course, obvious thing that has changed within the last generation, of course, is technology, right? So if you are part of the iGen, you do not remember a time before you were able to just text someone. It doesn't exist for you. For you, a phone has always been able to text, talk, and then most recently, FaceTime, right? So the ways in which you even look at a phone is very different, right? So the iPhone was released in 2007. Shortly thereafter, we have streaming services that are made available to the general public with YouTube and Netflix. So again, the iGen does not know what it's like to go to Blockbuster or to stand in line or to wait for a new movie to come out on a CD, right? And then Instagram was launched in 2010, and that means that now there's more social media platforms. So again, that's changing the ways in which students and this new generation is interacting. So how you friend someone, how you know someone. Oh, I know her, technically, right? Again, just kind of the idea of what a friendship means, the idea of what a conversation means, all of these kind of terms are really changing with this new generation. Because again, technology has taken great strides within the last 10 years, right? Okay, so I want to get a little bit deeper into this generation so we can better understand them. And if you're a part of this generation, I'd like to really hear from you towards the end of the conversation to see how you're perceiving your own education, right? And to see if maybe we're misinterpreting some myth about you, or maybe we're kind of like not understanding you to the fullest extent. So again, I think that we'll have a nice dialogue towards the end of the session. Okay, so the iGen'ers, as they are known, we should talk a little bit about the demographics, right? So there's a psychology professor by the name of Jean Twenge from the San Diego State University who kind of coined the term iGen in her 2006 book titled Generation Me. And then she went on to talk a little bit more about them in her 2017 book titled iGen. And she notes that 1 in 4 of people who identify as iGen'ers are Hispanic, okay? And nearly 1 in 20 identifies as multiracial, right? So the iGen generation is extremely diverse, both ethnically and culturally, more so than any other generation that we've had before. Why is that the case? Well, because we're living now in a much more globalized culture. We're living in a place now where we have blending of cultures. We have more metropolitan cities. Transportation has become much more accessible, right? So we can relocate much more effectively and quicker. So again, that's also kind of how we have to look at the iGen, right? That they're very diverse ethnically, culturally, that they currently are making up the largest generation alive, right? So as of, I think, this last year, that has actually now bumped up to the largest generation alive today. And in the US alone, there are 69 million iGen'ers. That's a lot of people who identify with that specific generation, right? So what are some of their beliefs and values? So what really matters to someone who identifies as part of the iGen? So there was a report that was recently done by a research firm, and the report was titled The Everything Guide to Generation Z, which is another name for the iGen. And they said that, again, that they're the most racially diverse generation, that they have very diverse social circles, which leads them to really hold as a core value that diversity is good, just across the board. For them, equality really matters, right? And I'm not just talking about just like, equality within a certain context. I mean equality across the board, race, gender, class, sexual orientation, right? For most people who identify as part of the iGen, equality is really important, which we've seen a shift from maybe the previous generations who had some reservations about what equality meant or what diversity means. And then 56% of iGen students, again, going back to the report from the Everything Guide to Generation Z, are really concerned about racism. And we have to then think about, well, why is it that they're so concerned about racism and issues of social justice? Well, what is the context that some of these iGen'ers are growing up in? What are some of the things that are happening on the news that might make people who identify as iGen'ers concerned about social justice? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great point, yes. So the growth and yes, so feminism, right? So we're having kind of a resurgence of feminist wave that's happening. We see it with the Me Too movement, right? We've seen it not just in Hollywood, but across the board. So yes, that's definitely something that would spark someone's interest in really thinking about, well, why is it that women are being treated unfairly or unequally, right? Yeah. What else? What are some of the other kind of stories that we see on the news that might make us pause and really consider, are we actually living in a community or in a society that wants to be socially just?
I would just say it's less to do with like specific news stories, because I think the news has always been like trending more and more towards acceptance, and more to do with the fact that
Right.
people are exposed to different communities through the internet and different cultures through the internet, and they have more exposure to these things. I mean, you know, schools aren't segregated anymore for one thing, but that's
course.
obviously like not as recent as the iGen. But I think it's less a case of like specific cultural movements and more the fact that these cultural movements arise because people care about equality and diversity, not people see these movements and go like, oh, I want equality now. Like
Okay,
these
right.
movements spring from the desire for equality. So
Sure, that's a great way to put it, right? So that it is kind of a symbiotic relationship, right? So you want to take action for a cause that you are passionate about, you want to see social equality happen, and the iGen generation is really interested in making that happen, right? They don't just sit around and watch passively, they're very much interested in becoming social advocates, right? And again, just other kind of recent, issues that have come to light within the last, 5 to 7 years, which has been when the iGen has come of age, have been issues like police brutality, right? That has been a really, a really kind of hot button topic in our nation that has engendered a lot of discussions about what does a socially just community look like, and why are we having things like this happen if we're claiming to be socially just, right? So again, these are kind of things that the iGen generation has grown up around, hearing, seeing, and as a result, they really believe that social justice is important for all. And as a result, again, they have developed a collective conscience, right? So it's not just so much about me as it was perhaps for the millennials, and it's more about us, right? So it's about maybe fundraising, right? How can I use this to collect funds for a cause that I care about, right? Or how can I use social media to promote this story, or to share this post, or to retweet this, right? To get attention to the topic I want at hand. So again, there has been a development of a collective conscience that has emerged as a result of this new generation. And then the iGen also has specific personality traits. So in a seminal study, so if you're interested in this particular topic, I suggest that you read Generation Z Goes to College. And again, the term Generation Z and the iGen are used interchangeably. And this is by Corey Semiller and Megan Grace. And they do an excellent job of kind of conducting their own study of this new generation that's going to college, but also of drawing from other research, other just kind of scholarship within the field to kind of understand this generation a little bit better. So according to the study, 85% of iGen'ers describe themselves as loyal, and they feel like they are able to exhibit strong concern for those around them. And again, that's due to the fact that we are kind of witnessing really high levels of social activity for social causes. 73% of iGen students describe themselves as compassionate, right? So they really do feel like they're compassionate. And again, given the context, it makes sense, right? Because technology makes it possible, as we had the gentleman mention previously, for us to connect with an issue immediately, right? We don't have to wait for the news to report on it. We can go to different sites, right? We can read it online. We can read about it from a different post, from social media. We can watch on the news. We can hear on the radio, right? So again, all of this is developing a more kind of awareness of what it means to be compassionate. So we have compassionate, thoughtful. Again, there's kind of the idea that they identify as thoughtful people. The iGen also really prides themselves in being open-minded. So again, this goes back to the core values and beliefs, right? Because this generation has the great ability to consider multiple perspectives and viewpoints, right? Unlike many other generations that came before them. So I think that's something that's very unique about the new generation that's emerging. And I think that's why a lot of programs like global learning initiatives and civic engagement programs are really taking off finally, because we have a generation of students that's really invested in seeing these things happen and make a change in their community. So again, there's the idea that it's important to see issues from multiple perspectives. They have a sense of social responsibility. They're determined to make a change and they're very optimistic about the future. And that does differ a little bit from millennials, who are a little bit more cautious about the future. The I generation seems to be a little bit more optimistic about what the future is to hold, and they do feel like they have the ability to make the change that they want to see happen. So that's also important to consider. Okay, so how does the iGen like to learn, right? So when we're thinking about just the iGen in higher education, what are some of kind of the modalities that they prefer? Well, first and foremost, the iGen really likes network learning. So that means that they're not so much like the lone wolf as much as the millennials might be, and they really prefer to work in teams and groups in a collaborative setting. They like to create, present, and consume ideas in digital and multimodal formats, right? So they're not content with just simply reading a short story and then having a discussion about it in a literature course, right? They really want to be able to access information and to respond to it in a digital platform, right? So again, that's something that they value deeply. They are also looking to learn with and through web-based software, learning management systems known as LMS, like Blackboard, Canvas. All of these things facilitate learning from afar, but also extending the walls of the classroom, right? So if you're in a class that requires for you to do Blackboard posts, well, you don't have to wait until you come to class. If it's a Monday, Wednesday, Friday to have that conversation. You can now do it online, right? Or in my class specifically, I teach a course where all of my students are writing their first 2 major essays in a team. So they're doing shared writing projects. And it's proven to be actually a really great experience. I've seen amazing papers. The quality and the depth of analysis has been just off the board, and their level of engagement has been really exciting. And what I've also changed recently is that I'm allowing my students to compose text in multimodal formats. So they're including links, videos, GIFs, right? They're using Adobe Spark. Instead of presenting an essay just on Word, you can use a different format to present your writing, right? Because again, you're not consuming literature or reading or information in a monomodal way anymore, right? No matter what you're reading, there's going to be an ad that pops up, right? Or there's going to be a link to another story that you might want to follow. So I'm encouraging my students to, in essence, recreate what they're experiencing in the real world in the writing classroom, because again, I think it's important that we teach skills that are applicable outside of the course content or the courses that we're teaching. And then, of course, you know, as we saw in the previous photo, this particular generation of students really likes to have their actual technology, right? So their tablets or laptops. I even allow phones in my class for research, right? So I have an assignment where students have to conduct primary research, meaning an interview or a questionnaire using their social media accounts. So, right, so why am I going to have a student, go, for instance, if they're interested in researching how first-year students are experiencing loneliness? Why am I going to have them stand outside of the dorms handing out pieces of paper when they can easily log on to their account on Instagram and reach way more people that they would if they were to distribute a survey manually, right? So again, just using these technologies to our advantages are really important, I think. And again, we have to strive to make our courses relatable and significant. These students are looking for important connections between what they're learning in the classroom and why they need to learn it. So students are no longer content with just hearing Shakespeare's great, you should just read him. It's not good enough, right? You have to provide variety and options, and I think that's great because it forces us as academics, as scholars, to reconsider the canon, right? So why do we have to have a whole bunch of old, dead white men in the canon? Why can't we have women that are alive? Why can't we have people of color, right? Why can't we have a variety and diversity in our literature, right? So again, this new generation of students is really having us reconsider, why are we learning what we're learning in the classroom, and how is it applicable beyond the course when you leave our class? Okay, so with that being said, of course, there are some challenges to teaching this new generation of students, right? So as I was mentioning before, they have quite a few expectations. And the problem that arises here then is that a lot of faculty are of the older generation, and they're trying to kind of bridge the gap between this very new, fast-paced, tech-savvy group of students and their way and kind of methodology to teaching. So there's kind of a learning curve that needs to be allowed, I think, for a couple of years for people to be able to kind of readjust to one another's expectations. But we as faculty, I firmly believe, have to extend ourselves and make those changes so that we are having engaging classrooms, right? So as a result of that, until the instructor is able to kind of make that leap or that concession, students might sometimes feel frustrated with the way that the material is being presented to them, maybe even bored, right? Because they're so accustomed to kind of having this fast-paced delivery of content information. So there's a study that was done recently in 2015 by these two great scholars, and they found a couple of really, I think, interesting highlights related to the specific generation of students. And the one that struck me the most was the lack of information literacy skills. So when I say information literacy skills, do we kind of understand what that means? Or, yeah? Does anyone want to offer like maybe just a informal definition? Okay. People that read a lot? Okay. Mm-hmm.
That we don't read a lot.
That you don't read a lot. Yeah, I don't, so that's a good start. I'm not sure necessarily that it's not that you're not reading, because you guys are reading a lot. I see it, right? And I refuse to believe that you're just online shopping all the time, right? So I know you're reading things, right? So it's not so much that you're not reading a lot. What might that signal that there's a lack of information literacy skills? Have you guys heard that phrase before? Maybe in your composition classes or your literature courses? Yeah, no? Do you want to give it a shot? Okay. The mic is coming.
Thank you. I guess an educated guess would probably be in terms of like grammar and et cetera, because, you know, today's generation is just heavily dependent on like social media, and there's there's definitely no grammar police there.
Right.
So I guess just in terms of that overall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and that's really a great point, and it's one that these scholars did not necessarily bring up in the study, but it's something that I experienced as an instructor, right? Definitely the 2 points, right? That actually in the case of the other gentleman that brought up the point about not reading enough, that might be more of a misconception, right? That maybe we as a different generation perceive it to be that way. And then the point that the young lady just brought up recently, I think is a great one, and it's definitely one that I, as a writing instructor, have experienced, right? Where students are not just accustomed to using the proper form of grammar or punctuation because they don't have to, right? When they're texting or posting something online, right? Yeah, so when these particular scholars say that they lack information literacy skills, means that this generation of students has a really hard time doing critical thinking about a piece of information, right? So because they have grown up in the age of just basically digital literacy, where everything's available to them instantaneously, they have a hard time differentiating fact from fiction, right? Fake news from real news, right? And as a result, the actual vetting process becomes much more difficult for them, right? So because they're just so accustomed to just reading stories, right? Reading multiple stories, snippets of stories, right? Very quickly, they're just taking the information at face value, right? So they don't have the necessary literacy skills to assess that information. So that's kind of the missing gap that these scholars have noticed. They've also noticed, and I think most of us have been able to observe this as well, that this generation of students has a very short attention span. And I have here some actual numbers for you. So they have reportedly, from this study, an 8-second attention span. And this is real stuff, yeah. And they have just like a primal need for an immediate response. I have students who will email me maybe like 15 minutes after they sent the email because they get very anxious that I have not responded. So I've now kind of trained myself to respond a little bit more efficiently. But I did have like a 24-hour window, and I've reduced that to 12. So with that being said, they really want things to happen and fast, right? So going back to the first point that we had here with the literacy skills, they read less than 20% of a text, right? So how many of you guys are part of this iGen in here, in this talk here? So based on that number, I would have to assume that most of you only read 20% of the New York Times article. Am I right? Maybe. You don't have to raise your hand. You can keep it to yourself. It's okay. So that's based on the study. That's what they're assuming, right? And that you guys spend just a little bit over 4 seconds for every 100 words that you read. So that's like lightning speed. So again, kind of you guys are processing information in a very different way. You guys have become very dependent on technology for it to just be there and to work all the time. And you guys just prefer to have kind of just a Renaissance kind of view and education on things rather than being a specialist, right? So for you guys, it's really important to know a little bit about everything versus a lot about one thing, which I think is interesting too, because it's kind of also shifting the ways in which we're doing majors, cognates, minors, right? So that's also, I think, an interesting point that these two scholars make here in terms of how it's kind of shifting the ways in which the actual generation is shifting, and then the education. Okay, so how do we then teach this new generation of students? Well, going back to a couple of things, I think it's important to design courses that sometimes have flipped classroom options. So that's where the instructor kind of takes a backseat and then allows the students to do a lot of kind of the teaching, but also a lot of collaborative learning. Hybrid courses are also great for this generation of students, so they like the idea of whether it be having a class that meets twice a week in person and then once that week online, or once a week online and then every other week in person, right? So they like the variety in terms of accessibility. In terms of teaching styles, they prefer active and experiential learning. So active learning would be things like small group work, mini presentations, a scavenger hunt that you might do for specific lists of words at the library. And experiential learning means that you learn by doing, right? So that might mean, going back to my initial example, well, if you're going to be conducting primary research, you're going to figure out how and why it matters through your own findings, right? So they're very interested in those kinds of learning opportunities. And also service learning. So service learning and civic engagement have become a huge part of my teaching focus for the last, I would say, like 3 to 4 years. And in most of my courses, students are asked to do some form of volunteering. And that's kind of built into the course itself. So whether it be working with a nonprofit or providing a solution to maybe a local problem and then actually implementing a solution, regardless of how it is that you're trying to achieve it, it's important for students to have an ability to engage with the community outside of the classroom. And then again, we talked about the LMS and having technology available in different mediums. That's also important for this generation of students. And they do appreciate that in the classes. Okay, so then that's how we teach them, but we also have to talk about how we engage them. So this particular scholar who focuses primarily on this generation of students has a really great quote that I think provides us with some good insight into the iGen'ers. And she says, today's students have never known a world without the internet. They've had a smartphone since they were barely teens. For faculty, this means we have to meet these students where they live, while still teaching them the material they will need to succeed in the workplace, be informed, well-rounded citizens, right? So again, we're seeing the ways in which this new generation of students is also shifting the ways in which faculty have to help them meet the needs of their education, right? So things are looking a little bit different from both ends, I would say. So I want to spend the last couple of minutes of our session talking a little bit about your experiences here. If you're a millennial or you identify as an iGen, I'd like to hear a little bit from you. And we've looked at a lot of different kind of words that describe the millennials and the iGen, right? And they're all very different adjectives. But I'd like for you guys to consider one word that describes your generation, and then you can tell me maybe why that's the case. Does anyone have like a good word you want to share? How you see yourselves or your generation more broadly? Yes.
The first word that came to mind was driven.
Oh, good.
As a generation, new generation, we have like this drive to be better than the last generation, or like the previous generations, not just one, but
Right.
multiple. And we just want to make the world a better place.
I like that. That's very well put. I think that's a great kind of snapshot of what it means to be part of the iGen, right? And why you're so different. Because for you, it's really important to, like you said, not just be better for yourselves, but also for the community at large. And I think that's great, and it's very unique to your generation. I saw maybe another hand go up. Who else wants to share? Does a millennial want to tell us how you feel now that we've been pushed out of the college system?
I would say self-centered.
Self-centered
Yes.
as a iGen student.
Yeah.
Okay, and why do you think that's the case?
Well, because we usually only care about ourselves. Like
Yeah?
we're worried about ourselves.
Okay.
Not about the person next to us.
Oh, well,
Not,
hopefully we can change that just a little bit, yes. But yeah, I think it varies for everyone. But self-centered, yeah, and I think that's something that's typically associated with the millennials, but it might be the same case for some iGen, right? We're not all cut from the same mold, right? So we're all a little bit different, and some might feel different than others, yeah. Okay, yeah, so I think those are good kind of ways to kind of think about how differently we see ourselves in these different generations. And I want to kind of probe a little bit deeper and get you guys to think as to how colleges and universities, so thinking first at the institutional level, how can institutions make learning more accessible and relatable for you, right? So we've already talked about your needs. We've talked about where you come from, why you feel the way you do. So why don't you guys throw around some ideas? How can higher ed make it work for you? What are some of the things that you would like to see in your college education?
Like one thing that frustrates me personally, and I see it, I guess, in older professors is sometimes, we use Canvas here at FIU, and sometimes they literally just don't use it. So like if there's ever any updates, like if you're not in class, you missed it. And I understand like you can get in touch with your classmates and stuff to
Sure.
get those updates, but sometimes, if someone's like very solitary, they don't want to talk, it can be difficult to like reach that gap.
Right. That's a great point. I think, being able to just, if we're all going to be on the same page about using these LMS, learning management systems, making the effort to have them be updated regularly, or having there be maybe a more clear line of communication, because that can be frustrating, and I could see why that would be the case. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, I just thought of one thing. So I am kind of like at the top end of Generation Z, where I still identify with a lot of the things that you were saying about technology of the millennials. Like I didn't always grow up with a cell phone that could text, But I think one thing that would be really beneficial to me would be to have core classes on information technology, just like basic classes, because I know that we all grew up in a technology predominant society, but I think it's a step too far to assume that we all know how to use it really well, because I know I don't. I really struggle in some of my classes that demand that we turn all of our papers in online, and I'm really bad with formatting sometimes, or like putting multimedia into those papers. So I think some core information technology classes would be really beneficial.
That is so interesting. That's actually a really good point, kind of maybe building those courses into the core curriculum, right? So much in the same way that we have, for instance, freshman experience, or I think now it's been renamed, right? SLS 1501, what is it? Yeah. SLS or first year writing, right? Courses are very basic and required. That's a great point, right? Having courses that help you be more efficient with technology, right, across the board. Because again, you're right. It is much too soon for us to assume that we're all on the same page, because clearly that's not the case, right? We're all at different points of the generational gap, and we're all relating to this moment very differently. So that's a great suggestion. I really appreciate that. And I think that would speak more directly to what your faculty could do to help you meet those needs. What about some of you that are having some positive experiences? Are you feeling like some of your courses are giving you kind of that drive to be your iGen self in the classroom? Are you having those experiences here?
I find that a lot of the work that I do that I enjoy the most, or I feel like I get the most out of, is case-based, because like you said, iGen tends to be so hyper-aware because we have access to a lot of information online, that if we're only lecturing or we're only learning conceptual things, it doesn't really keep our attention or motivate us. So
Right.
I think case-based learning is really beneficial in that case.
Excellent. That's a great point. Yeah, I do agree with that. I think that's something that we should strive for, right? Because I think we need to have a common ground for us to be working from. Yeah.
In classrooms where where the professor actually allow us to utilize our laptops and like do, in-class research topics and et cetera, I think that actually helps out, just the learning environment altogether as well versus, giving us a lecture and just showing us stuff from there, and then class is over. You don't really absorb. You're actually taking the time to apply what they're saying and looking up topics. And to me, I felt like those classes that I had, I was able to retain way much more information from, for sure.
Great. Yeah. So that definitely signals to me that you thrive with active learning, right, and experiential learning, and that's great. I think that's what a college education should provide you with. Is anyone doing really cool stuff in any of your courses? I'm always curious to see what other disciplines are doing. Are any of you having classes where you're either experimenting with emerging technologies or having the course run on a specific LMS that's more accessible than maybe Canvas or something that's a little bit more new? Are you guys working on projects that look very different from like a conventional paper research project? I'd like to kind of hear from you guys. Yeah, there's two over here.
I just wanted to add for like the previous like topic, I guess. My WST 3015 class is Global Gender and Women's Studies class. We're trying out the hybrid method.
Oh, great.
In my section specifically. So we meet Tuesdays from 11 to 12:15, and then Thursdays we don't have to go to the class, like
Okay.
unless she does it extra credit.
Okay.
And what she does is that she gives us like homework, but it's extra credit. We watch documentaries on like different situations and different topics that are relevant, and I've learned a lot.
Okay, so you are enjoying the kind of the hybrid course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she says it's extra credit, but like if you do it, it's extra credit, but it's also on the test, so you should do it.
Good.
But it's like a little motivation to do the assignments, because there's
Right.
like 11 assignments,
Mm-hmm.
and I think they're all very informational and very, very inspirational as well. And I think it's a great method.
Good. I'm happy to hear that. Yeah, I'm always curious to see how other disciplines are kind of dealing with the new generation, because I'm coming from a humanities background, more specifically literature, right? So the way in which I deliver my courses, plan my courses, my pedagogy as a whole is very different from that of someone in the sciences, right? So I'm always curious to see what other classes are doing. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just not this semester, but a previous semester. I remember in a class, as a final project was group projects doing presentations, and the only parameters were that it had to be informational, it had to be a specific time, and most people did like PowerPoint or Google Slides or whatever, but one person did a full-on video essay
Very cool.
as their presentation, where instead of talking, they filmed everything beforehand. They put in. And they basically use a lot of skills that they got outside of what most students had. And
Right.
yeah, it was impressive to see that kind of, video editing knowledge being used in such a effective way for a course that didn't expect it.
That's great. Yeah, and I think that's where we're really seeing the iGen kind of take over. This student is taking the lead and taking that risk to do something innovative and creative because he needs that for his own learning. And I think that's a great place to kind of conclude our talk. Well, I'm hoping that you guys see your own education shaping the future of higher ed in very distinctive ways. I think we kind of were able to touch on some of those points. And again, I'm always curious to see how different generations are learning differently and how we as higher ed faculty can better serve your needs as students. So again, thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing. I appreciate it, and good luck.